suit that seemed stiff on his rugged frame, the collar a reminder of how far he'd come from. What happens when a man known for escaping society gets trapped by it? Forever? Joshua Brown, the wilderness warrior from Alaskan Bush People, has just been hit with a sentence that doesn't just punish, it redefines who he's allowed to be. But this isn't just about courtrooms and consequences. This is about identity, legacy, and the brutal twist that no one saw coming. How did it get this far? And what does it mean for the entire Brown family? Stick around, because what we uncovered will leave you stunned. Long before the court dates and legal jargon, Joshua's world was rooted in raw survival. Raised off-grid by Billy and Amora Brown, his childhood was filled with challenges most kids could never imagine. While others focused on school dances and summer camps, Joshua was navigating moose trails, crafting makeshift shelters, and helping his family endure brutal Alaskan winters. Their life was hard, but it was theirs, untainted by the modern world's distractions. Billy Brown had one philosophy: live free or not at all. That idea wasn't just a motto. It became the lifeblood of the Brown legacy. No electricity, no roads, no bureaucracy, just nature and family. And for Joshua, that sense of independence shaped every decision he made. But everything changed in 2014 when the Discovery Channel put cameras on their way of life. What began as a show about wilderness living soon became a dramatic portrait of a unique, off-the-grid family, struggling to maintain their identity in a world that suddenly knew their names. Viewers were captivated by Joshua's calm demeanor, his steady hand amid chaos. Unlike his more spontaneous siblings, he emerged as the family's quiet anchor, the thoughtful son who measured each choice with care. Audiences respected him for it. Yet the same spotlight that elevated them also exposed their vulnerabilities. As the show gained popularity, so did the scrutiny. Social media sleuths and keen-eyed fans began piecing together inconsistencies in the family's timeline. Questions arose about the legitimacy of their permanent residency in Alaska, especially given the state's permanent fund dividend, an annual oil revenue payout reserved for full-time Alaskans. To qualify, recipients must prove they lived in Alaska all year, but photos, posts, and footage showed the Browns spending large amounts of time in the lower 48 states, even as they claimed to be residents up north. The allegations quickly snowballed. Investigators began dissecting travel logs, financial statements, and even reality show episodes to build their case. Between 2009 and 2012, records showed the Brown family, including Joshua, spent well over 180 days per year outside Alaska, directly violating the terms required to receive the dividend payments. That's when the spotlight turned from curiosity to confrontation. For Joshua, who had signed his own applications as an adult, the consequences were more severe. He had certified his residency each year, each signature a legal promise. Investigators claimed those promises were knowingly false. The Browns initially brushed off the accusations as misunderstandings. Billy defended his family, saying Alaska was their soul's home, no matter where they traveled. Joshua echoed his father, suggesting that the family's wandering nature made rigid residency laws hard to apply. But as evidence mounted, their defense began to crumble. What had seemed like a minor technicality began to resemble something much more serious, a breach of public trust in a system that relied on honesty. And as more documents surfaced, the state began to see a disturbing pattern. Joshua's specific involvement was now under a microscope. His filings, worth around $8,000 over 4 years, became the centerpiece of the investigation. Though small compared to their TV earnings, the issue wasn't the money, it was the principle. Alaska's program is built on an honor system, one that depends on citizens telling the truth. Prosecutors argued that misusing it, especially by public figures, damaged that trust. Ironically, the very show that had made the Browns famous now served as key evidence against them. Scenes filmed in states like Washington and Oregon conflicted directly with the family's sworn statements about living in Alaska. For Joshua, the weight of adult responsibility hit harder than any wilderness trial he'd faced. Unlike his younger siblings, he couldn't claim ignorance or parental influence. His name was on those forms. The closer the case moved toward trial, the narrower his options became. Prosecutors charged him with falsification and theft, offenses that threatened jail time and reputational ruin. For a man raised to live with integrity off the land, this wasn't just about legality, it was about identity. When the day finally came, Joshua stepped into a world as foreign to him as the Alaskan tundra was to the average man. Inside the polished walls of the Juneau courthouse, he looked almost out of place. Gone were the weather-worn boots and bare-clawed coats. Instead, he wore a formal the Woods. His father stood beside him in silence. They had braved so much together, but this battle was different. As the judge listened intently, prosecutors laid out their case. The Browns had knowingly claimed Alaska residency while residing elsewhere, taking funds from a system meant for true locals. Joshua's attorney countered, painting him as a man of limited formal education, raised in isolation, and following the lead of a father he trusted above all else. It was a subtle deflection of blame, one that introduced quiet tension between father and son. When questioned directly, Joshua's voice didn't waver. He explained, "My father always said home is where the heart is. Even when we were away, Alaska was home to us." The statement was heartfelt, even poetic, but it didn't satisfy the legal definitions the court was tasked with upholding. Then came the turning point. Prosecutors presented side-by-side comparisons of Joshua's signed applications and date-stamped photos placing him in California and Washington during those exact timelines. The contrast was stark, the evidence undeniable, and in that moment, the silence in the room said it all. The wilderness had taught Joshua to survive, to endure, to fight against impossible odds. But now, facing laws as cold and unforgiving as any Alaskan winter, he stood on unfamiliar ground, with no compass to guide him back. The courtroom atmosphere was electric, with a tension that felt almost cinematic, and yet the story unfolding was painfully real. When the last piece of evidence was accepted into the record, Joshua closed his eyes for a beat, as if bracing for a storm he couldn't outrun. The wilderness identity he had worn for years was now under siege by cold, hard facts, and as the judge began delivering the verdict, the courtroom stilled to the point where even a whispered breath might have felt too loud. Joshua stood shoulder to shoulder with his father, Billy, both solemn figures in a space that had just become their reckoning ground. The journey that had brought them fame also carried a cost they hadn't fully calculated: exposure, judgment, and now consequence. When the judge announced the charges, falsifying applications for Alaska's permanent fund and providing misleading information under oath, there was no shock in the room anymore, just the heavy silence of inevitability. Records showed them far from Alaska when they claimed to be living there, and financial logs painted a picture that left little room for reasonable doubt. "The court finds the evidence both credible and conclusive," the judge declared. That sentence alone shattered any lingering illusions. What had once been a life defined by freedom and authenticity was now legally classified as deception. One of reality TV's most rugged figures had just been declared guilty not by public opinion, but by a court of law. And then came the punishment, precise and piercing. Joshua was sentenced to 30 days in jail, without leniency. No shortcuts, no house arrest. For someone whose entire life was tied to movement and the outdoors, this wasn't just a physical confinement. It was a symbolic exile from the life he knew. The court acknowledges the unique challenges incarceration poses for those from unconventional backgrounds, the judge remarked. Still, the sentence was firm. Alaska's permanent fund wasn't just a bureaucratic benefit. To the people who lived by its rhythm, it was sacred. Violating that system wasn't seen as a minor infraction. It was a betrayal. Joshua also had to repay the funds, about $8,000 in benefits and additional penalties that brought the total closer to $10,000. But it wasn't just money. It was the message. Returning those funds meant returning a piece of trust that had been broken. As the figures were read aloud, a few Alaskan residents in the audience nodded quietly, their expressions hard to read, some mixture of relief, vindication, maybe even sadness. This wasn't about punishing a celebrity. It was about protecting a system that supported entire communities. Then came a sentence that hit harder than the jail time or fines. Joshua would never again be eligible for Alaska's dividend program. That door had closed forever. Unlike most punishments that have end dates, this was a permanent scar on his record. Legal analysts later pointed out how rare such bans were, typically reserved for repeat offenders or extreme cases. That the judge imposed it on Joshua suggested the offense carried more weight due to the family's visibility, or perhaps the duration over which the deception had occurred. No matter how many good deeds might follow, that chapter of Joshua's life was sealed shut. Brief moments in, captured by court cameras, his face revealed something that words couldn't capture. It wasn't resistance or anger. It looked like surrender, an acknowledgement that his journey had forked into a path he never saw coming. As the courtroom prepared for Joshua and Billy to be taken into custody, the gravity of it all came crashing down. This wasn't just about jail. It was about losing the freedom that had defined him. He got a few seconds to speak with family members before being led away. He whispered something to his mother, Amy, whose face remained composed but unreadable. That moment, unfilmed, unshared, was one of the few pieces of their story that stayed private. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, everything changed. Joshua's connection to the land that shaped him, to the image he helped build, now stood fractured by an unchangeable truth. This wasn't just punishment, it was identity, purpose, and belonging all being rewritten in one crushing sweep. The man who had battled the elements now faced an unfamiliar kind of wilderness, the inner terrain of regret, shame, and starting over. But the ripple didn't stop there. With both Joshua and Billy now absent, the Brown family structure, already delicate, began to shift under pressure. At Browntown, their self-constructed homestead, challenges erupted overnight. Joshua had always been the one who could fix what broke. Mechanical systems, tempers, even the occasional family feud. Without him, cracks turned into chasms. The boat engine sputtered and died, and no one else had his skill to bring it back to life. Winter nights grew colder as the generator malfunctioned, leaving them in literal and emotional darkness. Bear tried to step into the gap, but lacked the technical finesse that Joshua brought. Noah, creative as ever, offered solutions that were innovative but hard to execute in real time. The practical glue that had once kept Browntown together had dissolved, and it wasn't just tools and engines. It was the emotional core that had fractured. Joshua had always been a quiet anchor, less reactive than Bear, more present than Matt, more grounded than Noah. His absence felt like a missing heartbeat, one the rest of the family tried to echo, but couldn't replicate. Behind the scenes, those closest to the Browns described a slow unraveling. Roles became blurred, tempers flared more often, and the old routines that had once provided comfort now felt more like burdens. The wilderness had tested them countless times, but nothing had ever tested them like this. And perhaps that's the real paradox. For all the external battles they had faced in the forests and mountains, the true fight now lay within, rebuilding trust, redefining identity, and deciding whether the story of the Brown family would end in scandal or rebirth. As the final chapters of the Brown story unfolded, the weight of Joshua's absence became more than just emotional. It altered the very mechanics of their day-to-day survival. Bird, who had always lent a quiet strength to the family's rhythm, took over more kitchen duties. But without Joshua's fresh meat supply from the wild, even her resourcefulness began to crack. Gabe attempted to fill the void, but each decision he made was colored by hesitation, as if he could hear Joshua's confident voice questioning his choices. The image of the close-knit, self-reliant family began to flicker under the strain, revealing raw moments they never planned for the world to see. Amid this unraveling, Amy Brown remained the anchor, but even anchors have their limits. She bore the compounding stress with a composed facade, keeping her family from splintering, all while secretly grappling with health issues far more serious than anyone knew. The double blow of her husband's and son's simultaneous legal entanglements struck at the heart of everything they had built, especially because their entire lifestyle had been constructed to keep the outside world at bay. Those who knew her behind the scenes watched in silence as she grew visibly thinner, her eyes often locked on Billy in moments when Joshua's fate was quietly discussed. The woman who had faced down sub-zero storms was now enduring something far more piercing, a fear that everything might come crashing down. The younger Browns felt the pressure too. Rain, once the family's spirited optimist, recoiled from the internet after a flood of hurtful commentary about her brother. She deactivated her accounts and retreated from the digital world entirely. Snowbird, always more at home among trees than people, slipped deeper into solitude. She spent long hours tracking wildlife and avoiding any human interaction. Their family name, once synonymous with wild freedom, now carried baggage they didn't know how to unpack. The financial consequences hit swiftly and brutally. Even before the verdict, attorney fees and court costs had begun to erode their savings. With Joshua and Billy unable to participate in either the television show or subsistence efforts, the Browns' unique economy started to buckle. The carefully timed production calendar for Alaskan Bush People grew chaotic. Editors scrambled to mask Joshua's absence, but viewers quickly picked up on the missing energy. The disconnect between what aired and what was real only fueled more speculation. And then came the legal firestorm. News outlets pounced on Joshua's sentence with tabloid zeal. Cable networks aired side-by-side montages, the rugged wilderness builder now juxtaposed against sterile courtrooms. Social media exploded with hashtags and heated debates. The irony was impossible to ignore. A family revered for living off the grid now entangled in one of society's most conventional systems, the courtroom. Some fans felt betrayed, questioning how much of the show was genuine. Others doubled down in support, claiming Joshua's missteps were bureaucratic, not criminal. The schism in public opinion was sharp and personal, and it forced viewers to confront the question, how much truth do we expect from reality TV? Discovery Channel released a cautious statement. They acknowledged the controversy but reminded audiences that the incident predated their relationship with the Browns. They expressed confidence that the family would take responsibility. But behind closed doors, producers were reportedly panicked. The Browns weren't just stars, they were the face of a brand. Self-reliance, rugged honesty, and moral simplicity. Now that image was cracking, and everyone involved could feel the tremor. Back on the homestead, property taxes loomed large. Without Joshua's practical knowledge or muscle, plans to log timber stalled. The equipment needed routine care that only he knew how to provide. Noah floated the idea of creating crafts for tourism, but without Joshua's logistical mind, even that plan faltered. Bear's wild energy couldn't bridge the gap either. The Browns weren't just losing a son or a brother, they were losing their linchpin. Worse still, privacy, a pillar of the life they had chosen, began to erode. Locals who once respected their seclusion began driving past the property, cameras in hand. Some crossed lines, peering through trees, hoping to capture the crumbling image of a once mighty family. Without Joshua or Bam Bam to act as intermediaries, those blurry lines between public spectacle and private heartbreak were exposed, and painfully so. In the eye of the storm, Joshua was left to wrestle with the consequences that stretched far beyond jail walls. The words, "goodbye forever," haunted him. Not because of the court sentence itself, but because it meant being permanently removed from Alaska's permanent fund dividend program. This wasn't about money, it was about belonging. Since 1982, the program had symbolized connection to Alaska's soul. Being excluded stripped Joshua of something he had believed was part of his identity. His connection to the land was no longer official. That loss echoed louder than any judge's gavel. During his confinement, Joshua turned inward. He kept a journal, pouring thoughts onto paper about heritage, home, and how a person rebuilds after being exiled from everything familiar. His reflections weren't just about guilt or justice. They were about understanding who he was now that Alaska, in a legal sense, had shut its doors. For fans who followed their journey from wilderness to widespread fame, the question now wasn't just, what happened to Joshua? It was, what becomes of a family built on resilience when the foundation starts to crumble? And behind that story lies a rarely told truth about their finances. Over the years, the Browns accumulated an impressive portfolio. Joshua had a known fondness for rugged modified trucks suited for rough terrain, while Billy invested in real estate that mirrored their off-grid ideals. The family owned multiple acres in Washington state, which became their base after Alaska. Their private plane was modest but vital for remote travel. Joshua wore functional watches. Nothing flashy, but always durable. On the business side, the Browns had revenue from merchandise, book deals, and Discovery Channel partnerships. Insurance policies covered both their production liabilities and personal health care, essential for a life filled with physical demands. If there's one financial lesson to take from their story, it's this: diversify, stay grounded in your core values, and always plan for the storm you don't see coming. Joshua's fall wasn't just about legal missteps. It was a reckoning, a reminder that even in the wilderness, no one is immune from consequence. What remains to be seen is whether the family that weathered real storms can also endure this one. What's your take on how the Browns handled this chapter of their lives? Could they have done anything differently? Or were they simply caught in a system they never asked to be part of? Tell us what you think.